welcome to another session of AP Human Geography Review with Mr. Elrod. Today we're going to be looking at the multiple nuclei model as a pattern of urban organization. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to talk just briefly about some of the basics in terms of and revolving around the multiple nuclei model. So the first one, you have the people that developed it. Last names are Harris and Ullman. You'll notice that was developed in 1945. And if you pay attention to the time period, you'll know this is several years after the development of the sector model, which actually the multiple nuclei model was made in response to the concentric zone model as well as the sector model. Interestingly, that all of these models are supposed to be based upon the city of Chicago. And so the reason that that's interesting is because, as we'll see in a couple of minutes, really all three of these models are really quite different. Now, the thing to keep in mind is that they're made in different time periods, so the city of Chicago and its shape begins to change a little bit as the time changes and as the city itself begins to change, especially in terms of the economics of the city, especially as the transportation networks of the city begin to change as well. And so that's one thing that we'll look at here in just a couple of minutes. Now, the main emphasis of the multiple nuclei model that we need to pay attention to is this idea, the point that I have right here, that the activity space will attract and repel other types of activities. So if you look at the way that the multiple nuclei model is organized, the reason it's called multiple nuclei is because within the model itself, you have several different important spaces that are going to attract other types of activities around it. And so those types of spaces tend to be the different types of economic activities that are taking place in and around the city. So we'll pay attention to them. So the first one we have here obviously is the central business district, okay, represented by the 1 here, and that's all these tall buildings and things like that. So that's really going to be one of your first nuclei. Of course, the central business district, the area of greatest accessibility, the greatest retail space, and all those other kinds of things. A couple of other nuclei that we find around are things like the different types of industrial activities. So right here in space 2, we have the wholesale light manufacturing. So we're talking about not necessarily heavy industry, but smaller industries where things are maybe getting assembled or put together. We find some of the heavier manufacturing kind of towards the outskirts, some of the larger factories, where you actually have the processing of raw materials into finished products and just larger organizations. Okay, so we have spaces 1 and 2 that we've looked at. We got space 6 that we've looked at as heavy manufacturing. You also have things like out here, space 7. He says that it's an outlying business district, and so this is going to be something that's outside of the central business district. Now, again, you have these different nuclei that exist. Oh, and I forgot one, the industrial suburb, the industrial park that exists kind of outside of the main urban space. So these would really be kind of your nuclei that make up the multiple nuclei model. And what you find is that with the various economic activities, whether we're talking about the secondary economic activities or we're talking about the tertiary, so the manufacturing versus the service-oriented industries. I did not mean to draw that. Let's get rid of that real quick. If I know how to get rid of things. Things have changed on the old PowerPoint. There we go. All right. So what we find is that depending on what types of activities we have different types of residential spaces that are going to exist around it. And so we come over here to our pattern to find out what they are. So you'll notice that your area of kind of the lowest class residential, lower income individuals, things like that, they're going to be right here. Notice how they're connected directly to not only the heavy manufacturing, but also the light manufacturing, considering that this is primarily where they're going to be working, maybe even in some of the services that exist in the central business district. And they're directly connected because it makes it easier for them to access those things. And typically that's either going to be through walking or it's going to be through public transportation. Some of them are going to have independent transportation, but most of it's going to be based upon greater accessibility and connectivity to their space, which is why they are directly connected to it. So that was the spaces 3 here. Next, you'll notice we have space 4. Space 4 is going to be our medium class residential. So A little bit up above the low class, so some more suburban-like spaces, nicer houses, bigger houses than the low class. But notice how they are actually away from the different types of manufacturing activities. The people that can afford it don't want to be right next door to the manufacturing facilities, even if maybe they are foremen or shift bosses or things like that, or that work in the factories. They don't necessarily want to live right next door to the factories, and a lot of them are going to have their independent transportation, which allows them to travel which allows them to travel to the factory itself, and so they're going to want to distance themselves from that. Now, notice how they don't mind being connected to the central business district. There really is nothing that is going to necessarily cause them to be concerned about being connected to a central business district, because it typically is going to have the characteristics of being a place of prominence, being a place of significance, so they don't mind being connected there. Okay, and now we have, as the furthest types of residential space away, that's 5. That is the high class, the highest class residential areas. Now notice how they are separated from the low class, or separated from the manufacturing. They are connected to an outlying commercial area. They're out there an outlying business district, so they might be working here. A lot of them will be connected directly to the central business district, but they don't want to live near the inner city or around the inner city. They want some of the larger homes with maybe larger lots, maybe some of the estate homes and things like that. And so they're going to move themselves out this way and separate themselves. And so notice how it says in our 4th point here, it says activities in space will vary based upon what is nearby. Think about the idea of situation or relative location. Especially the residential areas are going to situate themselves based upon the different types of economic activities. Typically, you're going to have the economic activities come in, and then you're going to have the residential areas situate themselves around that based upon the types of activities they would like to be nearby. And one other thing that is here in our model is the residential suburb. So I'll circle that. This is spot 8. So this is not necessarily going to be the people that are as wealthy. It's not just because they're out here doesn't mean they're necessarily as wealthy as the people in the high class. What we have here are the people who are able to afford to be away from the city, whether because of their job, their income, or whatever, and don't necessarily want to be right next to central business districts. So this is going to be kind of your classical suburb, typically lower cost of housing, lower cost of land, lower taxes, those kinds of things. They're still close enough to interact with the central business district, but they're far enough away where they can be out in their suburban spaces and away from the relative density of the city. Some important things I want to point out here, though, into this first point right here. The multiple nuclei model cannot exist apart from independent transportation. People have to be independently mobile in order to live away from the different types of commercial activities and where their work is, whether it's in the central business district, whether it's in this outlying commercial district, the manufacturing, whatever it happens to be. So really, all the people that are here in the medium class residential, the high class residential, and then the residential suburb require independent transportation. So we're talking about cars, we're talking about highways, we're talking about larger, not just interstate highways, but larger state highways and things like that. And notice how it's different from the transportation corridors of the sector model. The sector model shows very clear corridors that are going to be connected by transportation networks. This doesn't necessarily show us the transportation network, but we know that they have to be there. The transportation infrastructure has to be there in order for the people to live out in these spaces and then interact with the various economic spaces around the city. And very similar to both the concentric zone model as well as the sector model, it allows for buffers. And the buffers are the things that I was mentioning earlier. The medium class residential has a buffer from the manufacturing. The central business district has a buffer from the heavy manufacturing. The high class has a buffer from the low class as well as all the manufacturing. So there's still those segregation of spaces that the people of the various economic levels are able to attain through the improvement in transportation. And so that's why we get those separation of activity spaces seen in the multiple nuclei model. I think it's worth our while to look at the different models. And remember, all of them are based upon the city of Chicago. So it's really interesting to see the emphasis that the different geographers put on the city itself and the way it developed, things like that. So you'll notice the concentric zone model. And if you remember our conversations before, really the concentric zone model based upon cost of land and accessibility to the central business district. Now, you know that people have got to travel, but again, there's really no indication here in terms of the types of transportation methods. It's really going to be more about cost of land and accessibility. Sector model, we still have the central business district, but clearly some of these transportation networks that radiate out from the central business district, especially the one that says transportation, a different idea of separation of space. Instead of being in these rings, which is very similar to the bid rent curve, you have these corridors that exist, kind of overlapping each other and extensions away from the city. And then we have the multiple nuclei model, more similar to the sector model in that it's going to require some transportation, but we have these nodes instead of just the central business district really as our node. We have several nodes that exist, and then what's going to happen is the residential activities are going to take place around those various nuclei that exist. Again, giving them separation, but also giving them accessibility to the different types of activities. So there you have it. That's the multiple nuclei model, as well as a brief comparison between the concentric zone model and the sector model. I hope you found that helpful. Thanks for watching, and as always, I hope to see you next time.